He died suddenly, at home, in his own bed. But then investigators found something that didn't belong. A deadly substance hidden in plain sight. And as they dug deeper, the story took a turn no one expected, because the woman grieving his death had just written a children's book about loss. What began as a sudden and heartbreaking loss quickly transformed into one of the most disturbing cases to come out of Utah in recent years. Eric Richins was found dead inside the home he shared with his wife, Kouri Richins. At first, there were no signs of violence and no immediate indication of foul play. Just a grieving family left searching for answers. But those answers would take a dark and unexpected turn. According to prosecutors, Eric hadn't died of natural causes at all. They allege he was poisoned with a lethal dose of fentanyl, and at the center of it all was the person closest to him, his wife. Kouri Richins wasn't just any suspect. In the months after Eric's death, she publicly portrayed herself as a grieving widow and even wrote and promoted a children's book about coping with loss, dedicated to helping her own children process the death of their father. That detail alone stunned people, because behind that public image, investigators say, was a very different story, one involving money, secrets, and a carefully constructed plan. As the case unfolded, prosecutors would lay out a timeline filled with chilling allegations, claiming this wasn't a sudden act but something far more deliberate. The defense, however, pushed back, arguing that the evidence didn't prove what the prosecution claimed. What really happened inside that home? Was this a tragic loss or something far more calculated? To understand how this case unraveled, we have to go back to the beginning, to the lives of Eric and Kouri Richins and the events that led up to that night. Eric Richins was a husband, a father, and by all accounts, a central figure in his family's life. He lived in Utah with his wife, Kouri Richins, and their children, a family that on the surface appeared stable and successful. They had built a life together in a quiet community, a place where neighbors knew each other, where routines felt predictable, and where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Kouri wasn't just a mother, she was also involved in business, working in real estate and managing financial matters tied to the family's assets. From the outside, it looked like a partnership, two people building a future together while raising their children. But beneath that surface, prosecutors would later argue the tensions were quietly building. According to court proceedings and reporting, financial issues became a key focus in the investigation. Prosecutors claimed that money and control over it played a central role in what would eventually happen. They pointed to alleged disputes involving property and finances, suggesting that the relationship between Eric and Kouri was more complicated than it appeared. At the same time, there were claims introduced during trial that raised even more concern, including allegations that Eric may have been the target of earlier attempts involving poisoning, claims that would later become a critical part of their case. Still, none of this was visible to the outside world. To friends, neighbors, and the wider community, this was a normal family. A husband and wife raising children, managing responsibilities, and moving through everyday life. And that's what made everything that followed so shocking. Because when Eric Richins died, there was no immediate sign that anything was wrong beyond the tragedy itself. No obvious struggle, no visible crime scene, just a sudden loss that left behind grief and questions. But as investigators began to look closer at the circumstances, the evidence, and the timeline, those questions started to grow. And what they would eventually uncover would challenge everything people. It was a night that at first seemed completely ordinary. Eric Richins was at home with his wife, Kouri, and there were no reports of conflict that evening. No signs that anything was about to go terribly wrong. But according to prosecutors, what happened that night was anything but ordinary. They alleged that Kouri prepared a drink for her husband, something simple and routine, a Moscow Mule, a cocktail made with vodka, ginger beer, and lime. There was nothing unusual about it, at least not on the surface. Eric drank it, and not long after, something changed. Prosecutors say the drink had been laced with fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid, a substance so potent that even a small amount can be deadly. Inside the home, there were no witnesses to what happened next, only the timeline that investigators would later piece together. At some point after consuming the drink, Eric became unresponsive and was found in bed. Emergency responders were called, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. Eric Richins was pronounced dead in those first moments. It didn't immediately appear to be a homicide. There were no visible injuries, no forced entry, and no obvious sign of a violent act, just a sudden, unexplained death. But as investigators began to examine the circumstances more closely, the details started to shift. Toxicology results would later reveal the presence of fentanyl in Eric's system at levels prosecutors described as lethal. And that discovery changed everything. Now, this wasn't just a tragic loss, it was a potential crime. And the focus quickly turned to the people closest to him. According to prosecutors, this wasn't the first time something like this may have happened. During the trial, they presented allegations that there had been prior attempts to poison Eric, incidents that at the time had not resulted in his death. Those claims painted a chilling picture, suggesting that if true, this wasn't a sudden or impulsive act, but something planned and repeated. Meanwhile, in the days and weeks following Eric's death, life on the outside appeared to move forward. Kouri Richins publicly stepped into the role of a grieving widow, speaking about loss and helping her children cope, and eventually authoring a children's book focused on grief, framed as a way to help her family heal after Eric's sudden passing. But behind the scenes, investigators were continuing to dig, examining timelines, financial records, communications, and the events leading up to that night. What they were building piece by piece was a case that suggested Eric Richins' death was not accidental but intentional. Still, at this stage, there were more questions than answers. How had the fentanyl been obtained? Why would someone do this? And could the evidence truly prove what prosecutors were claiming? As the investigation intensified, those questions would lead to a series of discoveries that would push the case in an even more shocking direction. Once fentanyl was confirmed in Eric Richins' system, the entire direction of the case shifted. What had initially appeared to be a sudden, unexplained death was now being treated as a potential homicide, and investigators began moving quickly. They focused first on the immediate environment, Eric's home, the place where he had spent his final hours, looking at what he consumed, who he was with, and what had happened in the narrow window of time leading up to his death. Very quickly, attention centered on one person, Kouri Richins. She had been there that night. She had prepared the drink prosecutors would later describe as the delivery method for the fentanyl, and she was the last known person to see Eric alive. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed evidence, so they started building a timeline. They examined communications, messages, records, and any digital footprint that could explain what led up to Eric's death. And they looked into financial documents, searching for motive. According to prosecutors, what they found began to paint a clearer picture, and money became a central focus. They alleged that Kouri stood to benefit financially from Eric's death. Investigators were working to answer a critical question. How did fentanyl enter the picture? Because this wasn't a substance you would expect to find in an ordinary household. During the investigation, and later presented in court, prosecutors claimed that Kouri had obtained fentanyl prior to Eric's death, alleging she had contacted an individual and arranged to acquire the drug. That claim, if true, would be a key piece of the case because it would suggest planning and intent. Then came another development that added an even more unsettling layer to the investigation. Prosecutors introduced allegations that this may not have been the first attempt, stating that there were earlier incidents where Eric had been given substances that made him ill, events that at the time did not result in his death. These alleged prior attempts became critical in shaping how investigators viewed the final incident, suggesting a pattern, a progression, something that had been building toward a fatal outcome. Meanwhile, Kouri Richins maintained her public image as a grieving spouse, speaking about loss, about her children, and about navigating life after tragedy. But behind the scenes, investigators were continuing to gather evidence, analyzing toxicology results in detail and working to establish how much fentanyl was in Eric's system and whether it could have been accidental. According to prosecutors, the level was far beyond what could be explained by chance. They also worked to corroborate the alleged acquisition of the drug, tracing connections, verifying communications, and linking timelines together. Every piece mattered because this case didn't rely on a traditional crime scene. There were no weapons left behind, no eyewitnesses to the act itself, and instead it was built on a chain of evidence: circumstantial, digital, financial, and forensic, all pointing. Prosecutors argued in the same direction. The defense, however, pushed back, challenging the interpretation of that evidence and questioning whether the prosecution could definitively prove intent or even direct responsibility. Because in a case like this, the margin for doubt is everything. As the investigation progressed and charges were brought, the story that had once seemed like a private family tragedy became something far more public and far more complex. And just when it seemed like the case was taking shape, new revelations would emerge, ones that would complicate the narrative even further and leave people questioning. What initially seemed like a straightforward prosecution began to take unexpected turns, because the deeper investigators and attorneys went, the more complicated the story became. One of the most striking developments centered around timing. After Eric Richins' death, while investigators were still working to determine what had happened, Kouri Richins stepped into the public eye in a way that caught many off guard.
The jury unanimously find that the defendant, Kouri Richins, is guilty of aggravated murder.
She wrote a children's book, a book about grief and about helping children cope with the loss of a loved one, presented as something deeply personal, and as a way to help her own children process the sudden death of their father. But as prosecutors later argued their case, that detail took on a very different meaning. What once appeared to be an act of healing was now viewed by some as deeply unsettling. And for many following the case, it raised a disturbing question. How could someone publicly guide others through grief while allegedly being responsible for the loss itself? That wasn't the only twist. During the trial, prosecutors introduced allegations that Eric may have been poisoned before, incidents that had not resulted in his death at the time. These claims added a new layer of tension because, if true, they suggested that Eric's death wasn't a one-time act, but the final step in a series of attempts. Still, these allegations also became a point of contention, with the defense challenging how these prior incidents were being interpreted and raising questions about whether they truly proved intent or were being used to create a narrative that went beyond the evidence. Then, there was the issue of motive. Prosecutors pointed to financial gain, arguing that money played a central role in what happened. But motive alone isn't proof. The defense emphasized that, arguing that suspicion, even strong suspicion, doesn't equal guilt. As both sides presented their arguments, the case became less about a single moment and more about how every piece fit together. Was this a carefully planned act driven by financial pressure? Or was the prosecution connecting dots that didn't fully prove what they claimed? With each new detail, the tension grew, because at the center of it all was a story that didn't fit neatly into one version of events. And as the trial approached its most critical stage, everything would come down to one question: what actually happened that night? In the end, the case came down to the evidence and how a jury interpreted it. Prosecutors laid out their theory piece by piece, arguing that Eric Richins did not die by accident and that his death was the result of a deliberate act. They pointed to the fentanyl, to the timeline, to the alleged efforts to obtain the drug, and to what they described as a clear financial motive. They also emphasized the pattern they believed had been building, claiming that this wasn't the first attempt, but the one that finally proved fatal. The defense pushed back, challenging those conclusions and questioning whether the prosecution had truly proven intent beyond a reasonable doubt. They argued that the case relied heavily on interpretation and not direct proof of what happened in that room. For the jury, the decision wasn't about speculation. It was about whether the evidence told a clear and consistent story, and ultimately, they reached a conclusion. Kouri Richins was found guilty of murdering her husband, Eric Richins. The verdict marked the moment where suspicion became certainty in the eyes of the court, transforming what had once appeared to be a tragic, unexplained death into a legally defined, calculated killing. A husband poisoned in his own home. A case built not on a single piece of evidence, but on a chain of details that together convinced a jury of the truth. And with that decision, the story that began with grief ended with a conviction. In the end, this case leaves behind more than just a verdict. It leaves behind a family forever changed. Children who lost their father and now must grow up with the reality of what the court determined happened to him. A loss that began as grief and turned into something far more complicated. Because cases like this don't just end when a jury reaches a decision. They linger, raising questions about trust, about what we think we know about the people closest to us, and about how something that appears normal on the surface can hide something far darker underneath. For many, one detail still stands out above all else: the image of a grieving wife writing a book to help her children cope with loss, and the unsettling contrast between that image and the conclusion reached in court. It's that contrast that continues to disturb people because it forces us to confront a difficult idea: that sometimes the truth doesn't look the way we expect it to. Eric Richins' life ended inside his own home, a place that should have been safe, and while a legal case may be closed, the emotional impact of what happened continues. In the end, this isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about perception, about trust, and about how easily those things can be broken. And maybe the most haunting question of all is this: how well do we really know the people closest to us?